Welcome to the lecture on how to use the comma effectively. Now, I jokingly call it the mystery revealed because I see that many people have problems with the rules for using the comma. I certainly did when I was in college. However, I think I've come up with a solution to this problem through this PowerPoint to help us really learn how to use the comma properly without necessarily having to understand the rules of why you're doing it, because we can learn about that later. Now, it's very easy to dismiss the importance of correct punctuation and to believe that no confusion can be caused when we don't use punctuation properly. However, what we find is that if we're clever with our punctuation, we can lend clarity to our writing, we can make it have much more impact. People will believe we are much more sophisticated in the way that we use language, and because of that, we will gain more credibility as a writer. Now, maybe you feel that that's wrong. Maybe you think that your ideas should be taken on their merit only. I wish that was the case. However, having clean, insightful, and sophisticated writing does give you credibility. So let's just jump right in and start looking at the proper uses of the comma. We use a comma to separate items or elements in a series. So in this case, we have the sentence, I like dogs, cats, and mice, and all the commas in this sentence are required. Some people believe that you don't need the final comma, or what's called the Oxford comma, but that is simply not the case, as we'll see in the next slide. This is a rather silly example that I like to show students, and the humor in it helps us to remember the importance of that quote-unquote Oxford comma. So here we have our first example sentence. We invited the strippers JFK and Stalin. And here we see that there are two commas separating all of those elements in a series. But if we take out the Oxford comma, or what is called the Oxford comma, we end up with the sentence, we invited the strippers JFK and Stalin, which seems to indicate that it is actually JFK and Stalin who are the strippers. As we see in this example, having that final comma really helps us delineate what we are trying to say. And there's nothing more important than clarity in your writing. Now, let's look at using commas to create connections. This particular rule will solve just about 90% of your comma issues. It clears up things like run-on sentences and comma splices. So it's a really important one to get down. So here is our example. He hit the ball hard, but he ran toward third base. The way this rule works is, if we have a subject and a verb before a coordinating conjunction, and there are only 7 of those, and, but, for, nor, yet, or, so. So if we have a subject and verb before the coordinating conjunction, and a subject and verb after the coordinating conjunction, the comma is required. The sort of official way of saying this is that a comma and a coordinating conjunction are used to connect two independent clauses. And what makes something an independent clause is if it's a complete sentence all on its own. So let's take a look at our next rule, what I like to call sentence inversion. In sentence inversion, we use a comma to set off introductory elements. So let's take a look at our example. Running toward third base, he suddenly realized how stupid he looked. Because this sentence does not begin directly with the subject, but rather has some introductory information presented first, we separate that out by the comma. You'll notice that we can switch the sentence around and say, he suddenly realized how stupid he looked running toward third base, and in that case there would be no comma. But when we invert the sentence and begin with an introductory element, we have to set that off with a comma. In our next example, we learn about setting off parenthetical elements using commas. So here is our example. Eleanor, his wife of 30 years, suddenly decided to open her own business. In this case, we have the subject, Eleanor, and then a little more information about the subject, his wife of 30 years, and then the rest of the sentence, suddenly decided to open her own business. Now, all the stuff that you see in yellow we could remove, and we'd still have a perfectly fine sentence. Eleanor suddenly decided to open her own business. But in this case, we get a little bit more information about who Eleanor is. And when we do it in this way, we must set that off with commas. Our next rule concerns absolute phrases. Now, our first example we actually know from a previous rule. Their years of training now forgotten, the soldiers broke ranks. Now we know this from our sentence inversion rule. We don't begin with the subject of the sentence, so we know we need to set that off with commas. In the next example, yes, it is always a matter, of course, of preparation and attitude. I like to call these types of phrases flavoring particles, in so much as they add a little bit of intrigue and interest to our sentences, though they are not strictly required for the meaning of the sentence. But if you're going to use something like those, you must set them off with commas. And in our last example, I'm telling you, Juanita, I couldn't be more surprised. Anytime you directly address someone in a sentence, you must set their name off with commas. Our next rule concerns coordinate adjectives. As you know, an adjective describes a noun, a person, place, or thing. So, we use a comma to separate coordinate adjectives if it sort of sounds like you could put a coordinating conjunction in place of the comma. Now, this is the only time you'll hear me say go with your gut when it comes to comma rules. So let's look at our example. He is a tall, distinguished, good-looking fellow. It is possible to put he is a tall and distinguished and good-looking fellow, and it does sound sort of correct. So we could go with the commas in this case. However, we would never say she is a little and old lady. We just say she is a little old lady. So in this case, there are no commas because we would never say she is a little and old lady. Our next rule concerns using quotes. We use a comma to set off quoted elements. So here is our example. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many things. So in this case, I want you to notice that the comma after is and the period after things fall within the quotation marks. This is specific to MLA and certain other style sheets, but you may find that in other style sheets, the punctuation goes outside of the quotations. For the purposes of our course, we want to put the punctuation inside of the quotation marks. There is an exception about using commas with quotations if you're using the word that. When you use the word that, we do not put a comma before the quote begins. So look at the example. Peter Coveney writes that the purpose of strength, blah, blah, blah. In this case, there is no comma because that never takes a comma, and we'll see that in another slide. There are several typographical reasons why we use a comma. For example, we put a comma between the city and state, Fall River, Mass. We put a comma between someone's name and their title, Jennifer Lavoie, Professor of English. We also use a comma between the day and year. July 4th, 1776 is registered as the birth date of American liberty. In this case, we have a comma following the 4 and the 6. But if we drop the day, we don't have any commas at all. July 1776 was one of the most eventful months in our history. Or, if we have the date in international or military format, we have no commas either. The Declaration of Independence was signed on 4 July 1776. A few slides back, you will remember when we were talking about quoted elements, we saw that if you lead off the quote with the word that, there is no comma. Well, here's the quick and dirty rule. That does not require a comma, but which requires a comma. Let me give you a quick note about that. A lot of people think that the word that and who are interchangeable, but it's important that if you're referring to a person, that you use who. For example, I have a sister who is a pain. That is correct. However, we wouldn't say I have a sister that is a pain. That is used for inanimate objects, animals, and so on. Let's talk about restrictive and non-restrictive. These are two rules that you'll recognize from our previous slide. Let's look at the restrictive element. Two sisters who sought refuge in a church died when the tornado hit. In this case, we don't see any commas at all, and we know that we don't see commas because that and who don't take commas, just like our previous slide says. Now we have the non-restrictive. Chateau Montelena, which is one of the more expensive Northern California wineries, won a gold medal for this year's bottling of Chardonnay. In this case, we see that we have those elements set off by commas. Now we know this from two other rules that we've already seen. The last one we saw was that which requires a comma, and we also know that this is further information about the subject. So we saw that rule very early on in our slideshow. So now we're seeing that there aren't really that many rules for the comma, and they all start to overlap just a little bit. Let's take a look at subordinate clauses. All you need to know about this is that you don't put a comma near because, not ever. That's all you need to know. We're tempted to do it. We've been taught to put a comma where we pause, and we tend to pause when we say the word because, but in all actuality, the rule is subordinate clauses are not separated by a comma. So let's look at our first example. The mayor decided to visit the protest site because she needed a first-hand report. In this case, beautiful sentence, no comma, makes great sense. Now, let's look at the sentence below. Because she needed a first-hand report, the mayor decided to visit the protest site. Now, you'll see in this case that we have a comma, but you'll also see that it's nowhere near the word because. And we also know we need a comma because of another rule that we already studied, which was that anytime we start with an introductory element, we set that element off with a comma. Let's talk briefly about the semicolon. We use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses when there is no coordinating conjunction. Okay, so let's look at our example. I like ice cream, I like cake. If we were to put a comma there, it would not be correct without a coordinating conjunction. But the semicolon does something a little special too. What the semicolon does is illustrate, in this particular instance, that I like ice cream and cake equally, that both sides of that sentence have equal weight. So when we use a semicolon, it's not just a way to replace a coordinating conjunction and to connect two independent clauses. Rather, it is a way to indicate to our readers that we care equally about both sides of that equation. I hope you found this lecture useful, and I hope that it helped to calm your anxiety a little bit about when and how to use the comma. The important thing to know is that, being able to use these things correctly, like the comma and the semicolon and so on, really lends your essays credibility because you look very sophisticated when you use these types of constructions.